Good morning, High Rock. One of the biggest topics of conversation this year has been the way that the pandemic, protests, and politics have exposed how divided our nation is. And it's not just red states and blue states. Our very neighborhoods reflect our division. If you tell me your zip code, I can probably make some pretty good guesses about your age, ethnicity, education level, income, marital status. As much as we long for solidarity, we keep finding ways to separate from each other. And this has divided not just neighborhoods, but households as families fight over politics. For some people, not being able to travel home this Thanksgiving feels like a bit of a relief. So they don't have to tiptoe around those same old arguments we have every year. Maybe we should expect that in our world, but the truth is that our churches are divided in much the same way. Almost 60 years ago, MLK lamented that it is appalling that the most segregated hour in Christian America is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. Since then, denominations have made myriad statements and commitments, but things haven't changed very much. More than half of U.S. churches are composed of only one racial group, meaning that not a single person of a different ethnicity attends. And fewer than one church in 5 has less than 80% from a single ethnic group. Churches like High Rock are an exception because overall, churches are nearly as segregated today as they were in Dr. King's day. But the Bible is clear that God doesn't want things this way. God is the one who created us in our assorted hues and personalities, and we see God's ideal when heaven is described in Isaiah as a feast for all peoples, meaning all nationalities and ethnicities of the world sharing and celebrating together. And this vision is repeated many times, including in Revelation 7, where God gives John a glimpse of what heaven will be like. And he records, "There before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language." In the original Greek, that word nation is ethnos, from which we get the word ethnicity. All of them. Not melted into one, but a marvelous multi-ethnic mosaic that reflects the mysterious complexity and yet complete unity of our three-in-one God. In fact, we read in Ephesians that one of the reasons Jesus came was to break down barriers between God and us, and between us and one another. Paul explains, "But now, in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one, and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility." Jesus literally gave his life to break down these divisions and called us to follow him. So why don't our churches or our cities look like Revelation 7 today? Why are we still so segregated? Let's take a moment to think about how we've seen some of this in our own lives. So if it's contrary to God's dream, what can we do about all the segregation we see? The solution the secular world put forward in the past 60 years was proximity. Move people of color into white neighborhoods and blue-collar people into white-collar neighborhoods. Bus city kids into the suburbs. Meanwhile, the new urbanism movement inspired affluent elites to deliberately move back into the cities their parents had abandoned. But instead of integration, we got gentrification. The poor were displaced so that downtown could enjoy a revival. And even where multiple ethnic or economic groups coexisted, it turned out that shared geography didn't translate into shared experience. For example, despite busing and the best intentions, suburban school cafeterias remain racially segregated. Turns out that we can overlap geography without intersecting at all. In cities, we may share the same streets, but we go to very different restaurants and shops and experience very different standards of living. We may live nearby, but social media and slanted TV networks put us in echo chambers where we never hear from people who don't already agree with us. We've simply replaced the visible walls with invisible ones that keep us just as divided. In churches, the solution proposed was multi-ethnic congregations. People would worship and pray their way to understanding and peace. Many churches made this their primary goal over the past several decades. And yet that hasn't worked out as expected either. Multi-ethnic congregations rarely stay that way very long and usually default to one ethnicity or another. Moreover, in her book, The Elusive Dream, sociologist Corey Little Edwards explains that almost all sustainably multi-ethnic churches are just white culture churches with other people in attendance. Even if the majority of the leadership and congregation are Black, Native, Asian, or Latinx, if you closed your eyes to skin color, most multi-ethnic churches follow the traditions and norms of white churches. She herself is a Black woman who attends a multi-ethnic church like that, so she's not condemning it completely. But she makes the point that while we have multi-ethnic churches, we have almost no multicultural churches, where the church culture reflects the values and history of a variety of cultures rather than just one. I believe that High Rock has made this same mistake. Though we welcome people of all colors and cultures, and we were started mostly by Koreans, in many ways our culture today is that of a very welcoming white church. I'm not proud of that, but we can't address it if we can't confess it. So why is that? Whether in our cities or our churches, if it's God's dream, why does true integration, in the sense of honoring multiple cultures, remain so elusive? Many books have been written all about this, so I can't answer all of that today, but we want to begin that conversation. And to do that, today I want to introduce you to my friend and High Rock Revelation 7 faculty member, Pastor Jua Robinson. For more than a year, I've been in a small group of Boston area pastors that he leads, and we share not only a friendship, but a desire to follow Jesus by breaking down the walls that keep us divided in both our churches and our communities. Instead of a typical sermon today, I want to share with you parts of a conversation Jua and I had about this as we walked through his neighborhood in Boston at the intersection of Jamaica Plain and Forest Hills. Come with us for a walk. Hey, Jua.
How are you?
Good to see you, buddy. Thanks for inviting me down here. You may not know, but I've been down here many times because Forest Hill Covenant Church is actually one of our denominational churches, but it's also a building that's important to you.
Yes. Our church, the church that I planted, our Heart Change Fellowship, we met here for several years.
Well, I'm glad to start here, and I'm looking forward to our day together. So why don't you lead the way?
Let's go.
So we're here at the Forest Hill T station, and you know, when I first started coming around here, because our church is so close, the Covenant Church, none of this was here.
Right.
And kind of we saw this at the time. We saw all the investment that was being made. Thought, wow, this is going to be a game changer for this neighborhood, because for so long, because of the way the highways kind of were organized, that the big flyover and just uncrossable roads, it was almost like there was a wall separating the more affluent part of the city and then kind of the more neglected parts of the city in Dorchester. And so a lot of us, at least me, we imagine, okay,
this is going to be breaking down that wall. This is going to be suddenly building a link and integrating these communities. And yet, I've heard that hasn't worked out quite the way that we'd all dreamed it might.
Right, yeah, it's very interesting because they've made such a huge investment in this community. As you mentioned, the flyover, the overpass is now down. There's now an opportunity for people to drive through and actually see what's in the community. But one of the interesting aspects about this Forest Hills T station is you kind of have 4 different parts. You kind of have the lower bus terminal, the higher bus terminal, the commuter rail, and the Orange Line. And what's interesting is in many of the instances, especially between the bus lines, you have the bus lines on the southern side that go primarily to points like Mattapan, Dorchester, parts of Roxbury. And then on the northern side with the buses, they go to the western suburbs. So
kind of more affluent.
More affluent, they go to
more
West
white.
Roxbury, predominantly white. And so it's very interesting that even in 2020, that this station is still somewhat segregated. When people begin to enter into the station, they may be there physically, but there's nothing to actually bring them together so that they actually have conversation and dialogue and actually learn from each other.
As we think about that, just our tendency to only be with people who echo our own narrative. Because we want to be the kind of people who are breaking down walls, who are building bridges, who are making new connections, and ending some of those alienations. How do you do that when clearly just proximity isn't enough?
Yes, proximity definitely isn't enough because you recognize even, you take the example of the station here, even versus the church. Like you can't just say, hey, we have people of kind of many ethnicities in the church and expect everyone to kind of come to the table and feel as if they are all being valued if it's not an intentional attempt to say, what can I learn from you? Tell me about your experiences. What has your experience been in this city or in this community? What is it like in the spaces you're in? And so it takes an intentional effort to come back and really ask those questions. I've seen many multi-ethnic churches where you have people who may be a person of color and they don't really feel valued because they're not really being leaned upon to ask questions about who they are or about their cultural experience. And so I think as the body, it behooves us to ask those questions, and no matter what spaces we're in, to really learn about people and to build intentional relationships so that it's actually mutually beneficial to each person.
Prior to High Rock, I had worked in a couple other great churches around the city that pride themselves on actually being multi-ethnic. And they started out as white churches and then now kind of have a much richer mosaic. But I think, I couldn't name this at the time. What we meant by multi-ethnic is anyone is welcome to come and join our service, our culture, our structures.
From a monocultural perspective.
And the largesse that we're offering, the graciousness that we're offering, the hospitality is we're going to pretend not to notice that you're not white. And so we're going to give you the privilege of being treated as though you're white. And we never named it, but again, that's sort of the baked in sort of white privilege, white supremacy that just assumes, of course, that's what you'd want, is just to be treated like one of us.
Just to be in here with us,
And in fact, I would never ask, hey, tell me about your perspective as that you're the things you can see that I can't see because you're not white, because you've had a different experience, because you have a different experience each day in the world. I would never ask that question because then that would be unwelcoming. I'd be treating you as if you're not white. But I think that just shows how superficial, even well-intentioned attempts at multi-ethnicity can end up being, and in fact, create further alienation when we are trying to bring reconciliation.
Yes, and it's a very hurtful gesture, because I've been in those spaces as well, where the idea, even without saying it, is you should be happy you're in the room.
That's
you
right.
Should be happy
you're lucky to be here.
That you're at this table because we invited you here. And so that's the unintended consequence of many of the spaces when there are assumptions about people in those spaces and not really an attempt to say, what can I learn? How can you teach me or inform me about my own experience? How am I holding on to potential biases presumptions and things of that nature. And so it takes kind of a relationship that actually brings it together in a way where there can be some mutual learnings from each group.
I also think it's not just around ethnicity that this happens.
Right.
It's around education.
Yes.
It's around income.
Yeah.
And so as relatively affluent people will pretend not to notice that the poor people that we've invited into this space and they're lucky to be here with us, that they're poor or that they're less educated, rather than assuming because they are less educated, because they have had to experience more scarcity, they have access to kinds of knowledge, kinds of wisdom that someone like me just not going to be able to see.
Right. Totally. They have a given experience. So I remember years ago I heard, you can learn something from any person if you just ask the right questions.
That's right.
And so with that same individual, they may know a host of information about a number of different things, but in many instances, assumptions are made so that those questions are never processed and never examined.
Questions are what break down barriers. And instead of going in with statements, having the humility to ask questions, to admit I don't know. And I think how interesting it is that Jesus asked so many questions and answered so few.
Right, it's totally true. And you think about Jesus and how those questions were always communicated to really bring out what was in that person. And so he asked the question and really was patient to wait on the response, to really give them an opportunity to kind of wrestle with it, to think about the complexity of the question, to think about the response, and then help them really figure out mentally and emotionally where the connection was with whatever he was communicated to them.
One of the core elements of learning is asking questions. And it's being curious. And the scientific method requires first saying, I don't know, so I'm going to challenge my own assumptions. And yet very few of us have the ability to take that same way of approaching our academic work and bringing that into our personal relationships. Because so often we think, well, hold it, I've got an advanced degree and whatever. I already know the right answers. And so my job is to dispense information rather than to be curious in my private and personal life in the same way that I am in my professional or academic life.
I think conversations like these really help because it helps people, especially who have maybe had that same type of lens, to recognize that, okay, that I can take those next steps to really finding out more about my faith and actually why I'm choosing to believe and hold on to the ideologies that I believe.
That's good. All right, well, let's move on, but this has been great stuff. So tell me about this place.
Yeah, so this is a school. Our church had we engaged this school in a number of different capacities. We had a mentoring program here where folks from our church committed to mentoring a student for an entire year. And so the mentoring program, we actually saw it as an opportunity to disciple. And so they would spend 4 hours a month with a student. And so just a great partnership with the school that also opened up the door for us to be able to do other things. One school year we said to the headmaster, we said, would you mind if we just prayed with you? And just had an opportunity to pray with you and any of your staff that was interested. And she said, absolutely, I'd love for you to pray with me. Prayed with her. And she said, this was so amazing. I so appreciate it. I feel like this is helping me, in my day. She said, would you mind coming back? And we said, sure, we'd love to come back. What are you thinking? We could do this quarterly? She said, no, can you come back next week? So we said, let's come back next week. So came back next week. She said, can we do this every Tuesday morning before school starts? That also allowed us to just have access to engaging other teachers and other administrative staff to the point to where when there were needs in the school, they would reach out to us. Whatever we do, how we love people, how we serve people, what we give, how we give, has to be informed from a perspective that is led by Christ and led by an opportunity to really think deeply around how are we actually serving these people? Is it actually helping them? And is it actually not just meeting a need, but is it being done in a way that really honors the people of that community.
As somebody who is a man of color,
Yeah.
who's been serving in this city for a long time, from the perspective kind of that you have from that, what would be your hope for the way that we would engage this city that you think, hey, this is something actually we really could do together?
Yeah. This was actually something that I talked about as well when I was pastoring, is as the body of Christ, how can we be seen as contributors and not just consumers? You know, how can we be known for the inherent value that we're adding into these spaces? And so even if you're living in the suburbs, you know, there are marginalized populations who even live in those communities. And, you know, you may live in a community that's, you know, 90%, you know, white. And if you look at some of the police reports, you may notice that, wow, 40% of the incidents in my city are with Black people or with Latinos. Like, why is that? And so beginning to take some deeper steps and some deeper dives into understanding some of the complexities that happen in your own local communities can also even to help you, to inform you about even ways in which you can engage within the city as well.
You know, I think something you just said is just so transferable to so many things and so important.
Right.
That making that move, you know, we're talking a lot of times in churches about trying to help our people, instead of just being consumers of kind of spiritual goods and services and, you know, were you entertained kind of thing, to being able to be contributors and saying, no, God actually has given you gifts as a part of the body. You are an important part of this body, and if you don't serve your function, the whole body is going to miss out.
We all suffer.
And we think about that as a church. But you know, that same mentality, that same calling and responsibility applies to the way that we interact in our families, and it applies to the way that we interact in our communities. That it's not just what am I getting out of this, but what am I able to uniquely add that makes this whole city more robust. And oftentimes we talk about that phrase from Jeremiah, you know, the call that God gives is to seek the peace, the shalom, the flourishing of the city, of this place where I've called you. And a lot of times we've reduced that to just peace. Am I seeing open conflict and hostility? No. Am I part of open hostility? No. Well, mission accomplished. But it really means more seek the flourishing of your city. And part of seeking it means actually like go out. Go out and do something. Get engaged. Pick up a shovel or just make some effort. Extend yourself. Take a risk.
And begin to say, what are outlets where God could potentially use me to be an advocate? You know, obviously we know that God calls us to, you know, love our families. You know, He wants us to see our work as ministry as well, right? But then also to be able to see kind of the communities that I'm in or have access in, and say, how can I be an advocate for others? How can I be a resource for others? How can I love others? How can I serve others as Christ has kind of blessed me?
Well, I appreciate so much you saying that it's not that I want to pretend I don't have this education, I don't have this privilege. I do have it, and in fact, the best gift I can give is owning there is privilege to being white. There is privilege in this society to being educated. There is privilege to being affluent. There's all these privileges. And so the gift that I can give is not to evacuate all of that, but instead to leverage it for the sake of others. And so one of the phrases we use a lot is, we're not asking you to do something that's contrary to who you are. We're actually asking you to be who you are. Believing that God made you who you are as a gift to the body, as a gift to everyone else. So how do you be yourself for others?
And I mean, and this kind of even goes back to what we're talking about with Jesus. Like, He didn't deny kind of the character of who He was in order to love fallen humanity. He brought his entire self. And so, you know, I think the way in which you've articulated it really well, and you know, I appreciate kind of hearing how you flesh this out with High Rock, because it's such an important conversation.
Oh, well, great. Man, this has been such a great day. I've really appreciated this time with you.
So great to be with you. Thanks for coming out to my community.
Those were just a few snippets from our day together. We'll share more this Friday on our Facebook page. One of the parts we didn't include was our discussion about what we can do to move beyond the barriers we've become so accustomed to. How can we move beyond polite coexistence to genuine intimacy and mutual blessing? Two of the first steps are ones we learned from Jesus. Jesus came to reconcile the world to God and one another by breaking down barriers. So we can probably learn about how to do that from watching him. And here's an amazing fact. In the 4 Bible books about Jesus, he asks exactly 307 questions, but answers only 3. It's funny because we prefer having all the answers, but Jesus, who actually has all the answers, shows us just how powerful questions can be. They can break down walls that only grow higher when we attack them with our best arguments. It's not enough to live in the same town and attend the same church if we don't learn from each other. But asking questions isn't natural for a lot of us. I'm a preacher. I'm white, male, straight, affluent, and highly educated. I've been trained to speak and dispense answers. I feel good about myself when I'm giving answers. Very little about my life trained me to listen well, except to people who were more affluent or educated than I was, and usually those people were white men. I noticed it even when I was watching the video of Pastor Jua and me. I talked a lot, even though I'd gone there to listen. Despite our educations, there are many realities that people like me may not see on our own. For example, until friends and books helped me, I didn't see racism or sexism, because they never happened to me. The only way I can learn the truth about them is by listening to and learning from those who do experience them. This is one reason High Rock created the Revelation 7 faculty, to help us hear from people who can see things that I can't, including ways that some of us may be using our privilege to hurt people without knowing it. They're helping our board of counselors think more deeply about racial issues, but when they preach here, they rarely talk about race. They preach the Bible, and they talk about God and truth, and justice and love, but they do it from a perspective that's different from mine, because they've had a different life than mine. They see truth that people like me often don't. But we can learn about it by listening. Let's take a short break to discuss that by considering these questions on the screen. Learning to listen is the first step. The second step Pastor Jua and I borrowed from Jesus is from Philippians 2, which describes the way that Jesus refused to cling to his privilege and power in order to protect himself from discomfort, but instead left heaven to come be with us as one of us. Now, Jesus could have floated 3 feet above the ground or glowed so that everyone know that he's special. But instead, he chose to become a servant. Jesus didn't fight to be treated like he deserved. Jesus humbled himself in order to sacrificially love people. It was risky. Jesus had to be vulnerable, and he got hurt. But God so loved the world that he came here as a baby, born in poverty in a society that was being oppressed. What could make our communities or churches look more like that worship service we see in Revelation 7? It'll take a lot of steps, but it will begin when people with power and privilege choose to listen and humble ourselves to serve others in love instead of expecting everybody else to serve us or do things our way. And by the way, if you're not white or not male, don't think this doesn't apply to you. Most high rockers enjoy forms of privilege. Many of you need to be listened to more. But all of us need to listen more. At High Rock, we have a long way to go. If you're a person of color or a person who's experienced any kind of marginalization, I want to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for thinking that treating you as if you're white would be a gift, when in fact, that's the problem. I'm sorry that it's taken so long to realize all this. I know you could have told those of us with privilege, and you probably did, but we didn't listen very well. I'm sorry. We want to listen better. For High Rock, racial and gender righteousness are not fads that we're going to move on from when the news cycle changes. I know it's complex, and no one has it all figured out yet, but we're committed to listening and learning because we know that many of you have a lot to teach. We won't get there this week or this year, but each week I want to make small steps in this long journey towards God's dream that we see in Revelation 7. And by God's grace, we will get there if we follow Jesus and walk together.
You're the God of this city. You're the King of these people. You're the Lord of this nation. You are. You're the light in this darkness. You're the hope to the hopeless. You're the peace to the restless. You are. There is no one like our God. And there is no one like you, God. There is no one like our God. And there is no one like you, God. And greater things have yet to come, and greater things are still to be done in this day. And greater things have yet to come, and greater things are still to be done here. And greater things have yet to come, and greater things are still to be done in this city. And greater things have yet to come, and greater things are still to be done.